Hi everyone, welcome to BRICS Briefs. Today we are privileged to engage with Professor Yan Liang, a leading expert in modern monetary theory, MMT, international finance, and the political economy of global development. As a distinguished professor at Willamette University and a research associate at the Levi Economics Institute, Professor Liang's work provides a vital perspective on how monetary policy influences global economic dynamics, particularly in the context of BRICS Plus nations and the Global South. As the BRICS Plus bloc, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the additional members and partners, works towards reshaping global finance through de-dollarization, alternative monetary frameworks, and infrastructure-driven economic growth, their skill in effective leadership and management is being tested. This interview will delve into the intersection of modern monetary theory and the evolving economic strategies of BRICS Plus, exploring the challenges and opportunities for fostering fair development and financial sovereignty. With her extensive knowledge and keen insights into economic reforms, Professor Liang will illuminate how innovative approaches, such as MMT principles, could address inequality and financial instability in both developing and emerging economies. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the generous introduction.
Oh, sure. Oh, thank you very much. Let's start off by asking you to firmly and concisely define for the audience, specifically, what is MMT in simple terms, please?
Right. So MMT is a factual description of how fiscal and monetary systems work. It basically builds on many what we would call heterodox economics or the non-mainstream economics. So it really goes into the history and the nature of money, what money is, right? That money is a basic credit and debt relationship that has a public sort of in nature, right? That is a public creature, so to speak. It's a very important institution in capitalism. And so understanding the nature of money would then lead us to genuine understanding of how the monetary system works and how fiscal spending works. And so all of this drive home the conclusion that money is public money. And when we have the public money, we need to harness the power of money for public costs. And so I think that is really the bottom line of MMT.
Ah, very interesting. Okay. All right. Good. We established that firmly. Thank you very much. So, as a first question, so on monetary systems and inequality, on that topic, um, the mainstream narrative often emphasizes the need to overhaul the current monetary system. In your opinion, is the growing inequality and economic instability in Western countries primarily due to the monetary system itself, or does it stem more from the economic policies adopted by the governments?
Yeah. Well, I think these two are, I would say, the two sides of the same coin, right? So they're very much integrated, interrelated. So we know that capitalism is a monetary system. The driving force of capitalism is about monetary profit accumulation. So money is at the front and center of the system. So when you think about the monetary system design, what we think about is who has the money, right? Would have the power to move things. So how do we use the resources to produce for whom? What do we produce? And who should get all this output? All of this is in the system of this capitalism, right? And money, again, is the driving force of that. So to be more specific, when you think about a very interesting phenomenon that we witnessed very recently, let's say in 2021, you mentioned about inequality and poverty, right? Let's think about this for a minute. The mainstream always tells us that money is scarce. We always have to fight the money and we have to think about how to use the money. But the matter of fact is, when we think about in 2021 in the United States, the poverty rate reached a historical low of 8%, right? Then 2022, we have a real GDP growth of 2.1% year over year. So we went from a 25 trillion economy to about over 26 trillion economy from 2021 to 2022. And yet in 2022, we have 14.5 million more Americans that are below poverty line. Okay, so there's an increase of 14 plus million people that fell below the poverty line. And so that pushed the poverty rate to 12.4%, right? Just in 1 year, from 8% to 12%. And this is the time when the GDP is actually growing. So you can't help to wonder, right? We are very productive. We're using all the resources. We're growing the economy by trillions in a year span. Why all of a sudden so many people fell back to poverty? Well, the reason is very simple, okay? It's because some of these American Recovery Act, right, the ARA, which was a relief program because of the pandemic, was expired, right? Many of the programs, the policies, like the child earned tax credit was expired that year in 2022. So that basically pushed about 5 million children to poverty. So I think that is just back to the question, right? If we are a very productive economy, then why, as we grow more, as we produce more output, we push more people down to poverty, right? So you're right, this is a flawed design, both of the capitalism system, but also of the very defunct government policy that do not work for the general public interest. And so I think that is a great example. And a broader issue, I actually recently co-authored a chapter to a book. It's called Beyond Economic Precarity. And we talk about this so-called money manager capitalism, right? Where we see this rise of the so-called money managers. So you could think of these institutional investors, pension funds, hedge funds. They are basically taking a lot of control of the economy from affecting or influencing corporations, right, to maximize shareholder values. They cut workforce, they outsource, they offshore, they cut to the bone in order to use the cash to do stock buybacks, right? And so that increases the shareholders at the expense of all the stakeholders. And so that's why we see the hollowing out of industrialization. We see, the middle class is shrinking. We see rising inequality and poverty and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, I think it's money, right? Who has the money that use the power to enrich themselves, to impoverish the others. So I think that is why it's important to understand what money is and who controls the money and how to design the monetary system to the benefit of the general public, right? Instead of the oligarchs and all these money managers and the government institutions that are pretty much captured by this kinds of Wall Street interest.
Yeah. I will note, I'm pretty sure that stock buybacks were not legal previously. Do you know?
Right.
Yeah, because obviously that was sort of propping up a particular company's value, perceived value. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. There's a lot of things actually over the years where deregulation and the laws have been changed to favor this hyper-capitalization, hyper-capitalism, for want of a better term. That is not good for the general public. So, yeah, I totally agree because I'm interested as a common citizen in the general welfare of everyone, my family, the future, my children. So, yeah. Okay, well, let me ask you on the same topic, so monetary systems and inequality, can the application of MMT principles offer a viable solution to these challenges within the existing monetary framework?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, MMT is pretty much a description, right, of how things work. It's, sort of like a balance sheet entry that you need to have the double entry for any transactions. So MMT is pretty much like that, right? It's basically a description of how things work, right? When the Treasury spends, it increases the bank reserves in the banking system, right? It's a description. So there's not really sort of application, right, of the MMT sort of principles. I mean, countries do this. When you are monetary sovereign government, you have the monopoly power of your currency, right? This is just a factual description. So in that sense, any countries that has the monetary sovereignty, the MMT principles applies. So you can't choose not to apply MMT, so to speak, right? And by monetary sovereignty, what MMT means is this is a public authority that has the power to dictate what is the monetary unit of account, right? So in Australia, it's the Australian dollar. In China, it's the yuan. In the US, it's the US dollar. In Japan, it's the yen, right? In South Africa, is the rand. So the government has the power to decide on what is the monetary unit of account. And the government also has the power to impose taxes and other obligations where the citizens would have to deliver the monetary unit of account to settle the kinds of obligations that are imposed on them. This is what we mean by monetary sovereignty. So for countries like Australia, it has the full monetary sovereignty, China as well. There are countries that peg the currencies with foreign currency, right? That they promise, if you give me the yuan, I will give you the dollar back at $8 a yuan. A yuan per dollar. Let's take this as example hypothetically, right? With a fixed exchange rate. Then you are tying your hands to some degree because you have to have the dollar, right, when you wanted to issue your yuan. So some exchange rate systems would compromise some of your monetary sovereignty. The extreme example would be countries like El Salvador and Ecuador that give up their own, currency and adopt the dollar instead, right? That's what we really mean by dollarization. So those countries don't have as much monetary sovereignty, right? For example, when the treasury wants to spend, then they have to get the dollar to be able to spend. So in some ways, the government's ability to utilize the public money for public cause is limited. So in that sense, I would say, as long as you have the monetary sovereignty, right, even if you are not having the full monetary sovereignty, it gives you some policymaking autonomy and power, right? So you should be able to use the public money for public causes. So take the United States as again, an example, right? During the pandemic, the government can all of a sudden come up with $5 trillion of extra relief checks to the citizens. No one is asking, where does the money come from? Well, the government simply creates it, right? And nobody's going to ask the question when the defense budget is 800 billion and they actually spend about 1.5 trillion, in 2022, as we mentioned, the time when they let expired all these pandemic relief programs, and yet they beef up their military spending. Nobody's asking why, when we cannot give these income supplements to the poor children, and yet we have all the money to spend for military, right, for the so-called defense.
Right.
So I think that is really the problem, is that when we design a monetary system that does not really work for the people, and yet we come up with all these lies about we don't have the money, right? I think what MMT is trying to do is to debunk this kind of myths. We have the money, we can find the money, we can create the money. The question is, what do we do with the money? And also, what are the real constraints, right? We could have all the money we need, but we may not have the human talents, we may not have the material resources that we need to fulfill all these goals that to deliver for our people. So those are the things that I think are important, from an MMT's perspective.
That's very interesting. I can't help, from my own experience, and I'm a relative layman, so I'm not going to ambush you here, but it's sort of off our script here. But I can't help think what you're describing here is that the government is actually in control of deciding how much money, managing that, and deciding on where to spend it, which sounds very much like the American system, the traditional American system. Obviously, that's not the case now. Is there a parallel there? I mean, I just want to join the dots here a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, let me say you're being humbled, right? In fact, I think a lot of the economists, right, after years of, I would say, brainwashed, right, they're indoctrinated with these mainstream fantasy. They actually can't really cut through the thickness of the daily pocketbook economics. And I think it's actually the people who really understand, the system is not working in their favor, right? And I agree with you. I think United States is a country that has the full monetary sovereignty, right? As long as the Congress, which is supposed to, again, represent the people's interest, when they pass the budgets, right, that basically says, here are the things that people want to spend money on, then the Treasury is supposed to spend the money, right? Do the fiscal spending as Congress has authorized and appropriated. And then later on, the government may levy some taxes to make sure that people actually would work for the money, right? Because they have the obligations to earn the dollar to pay their tax. They may also decide to sell some government securities or the bonds, right? And according to the MMT perspective, why would the government need to sell bonds? In other words, borrow, right? When they have the full control of their currency.
Right.
Well, I think the very simple reason for that is because when the government spends money, right? Let's say I buy a computer from a private seller, right? I would credit the private seller's bank account. And so that would increase the amounts of the money, right? Or the so-called reserves in the system, in the economic system, okay? When we have so much money, right? When we have so much reserves in the economy, that tends to push down the interest rates, okay? So the government may decide, or the central bank in this case, rather, right? They decide that there is too much downward pressure on the interest rate, and therefore they decide that they want to sell the treasury securities to drain the actual reserves from the economic system. And so that's why you have this bond sales, this idea that we want to sell bonds so that we can drain or retrieve, right, back some of these reserves. In any case, I think, not going through this sort of the nitty-gritty details, but I think suffice to really just to make it clear that for a sovereign government, they don't really need to borrow money. They don't really need to tax you before they can spend, right? When you push to the logical extreme, how do people have the money to pay taxes in the first place? How do people have the money to buy the government security in the first place? Right? The government has to first spend the money into existence. But again, go back to your question. Yes, the way the government should spend the money should be decided through a democratic process. That we should have a say about what the government spends the money on, right? And therefore, you do go through these sort of this formal democratic process here in the United States. You choose a president in your House or Senate every 4 years, and then the midterm election. But in any case, I think the problem is that a lot of times this doesn't really happen. That a lot of times the budgetary decision does not really represent the people's interest. So again, the example of paying $900 billion on treasury interests, right? And who gets the money? Only the billionaires, right? The people who have a lot of those financial assets, and then the defense spending, right? Whereas there is many really real needs in the economy, they're not being fulfilled.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, actually, let's bring it sort of back to BRICS a bit, because I really appreciate that you've gone over that. The theory and practice, because I think that's important for the audience, to get an idea. And this is your first time on the show too, so but in the sense of BRICS Plus and MMT alignment, so Western governments adhere to neoliberal economic policies, which you've sort of hinted on a bit here. In your view, do the monetary and fiscal policies pursued by BRICS Plus nations align more closely with MMT principles, or are they significantly different?
Right. So again, when you think about the BRICS countries, I would say all of them have certain degrees of monetary sovereignty, right? Some governments have more external debt that is denominated in the US dollar. And so that kind of obliged them to come up with the dollars to pay the debt. So in some ways, they're constrained. So theoretically speaking, all these countries should be able to pursue their full or largely full monetary sovereignty and policymaking autonomy. But unfortunately, I think, again, going back to this idea that we have a very unequal world, right? Very unequal, very unjust, that we have the global North countries or the Western economies that to a great extent control, right? That they have the power to control, for example, the resources in the world. What I mean by that is, in economics, sometimes we call the ability or the inability, rather, of some developing countries to get access to the international markets for certain resources, there is a limitation of that ability, and economists call it a regional sin, right? So, for example, if you are, South Africa, right? If you need to buy oil in the international market, well, the oil is denominated, or the trade invoice is in the US dollar, right? So unless you can get dollar, you are not able to buy oil in the international market, right? Same for a country like Ethiopia, right? If they need to import food, staple food, right? The food in the international market is invoiced in the dollar. So sometimes you find these countries in the constraints where they're not able to borrow in their own currency, or they could, but very limited, right? So they would have to get the dollars or the euros or whatever those major currencies are. So that, to some degree, I think they're constrained in the sense that they are trapped that in a system where they have to work and produce commodities, right? Very low value added agricultural products, labor intensive manufacturing goods, natural resources, be commodities like oil or critical minerals that others desire, to sell all these commodities at a really, really low price in order to get the dollar to be able to buy other things that they need from the international market. So I think to that degree, to some degree, these countries are not as, I would say, free, right, as the global North countries to pursue certain fiscal spending or monetary expansion or any other kind of developmental oriented policies. So I think this is a unjust and a very sort of an entrapment of the global South countries, because they are put in a position where they are very low in the global value chain. They're really adding very little value in their production, and even if what they do is super productive, they're not able to get a good price in the international market, right? So in that sense, they are trapped in that low value added production. And they're also entrapped because they are in some ways forced to borrow dollars from the international market and pay a very hefty price for that, right? When you look at the African, right, when you look at the African countries today, right, they're having $900 billion of external debt, largely denominated in foreign currency. They're paying more interest than what they spend on health and education and investment, right? So, this is really, I think, a great impediment to their developmental-oriented policies, right, and to their development projects. And that's why I think the global South countries, represented by BRICS and now BRICS Plus, are really trying to strike for a different system, right? The system that would put development first, that would put developing countries' interests more at the forefront, right? Instead of, always at the service, right, of the global North countries.
Yes, we definitely are, and we advocate that on the channel quite heavily. And there's issues, which I'm sure you may point out in the rest of our discussion. But we want people of all countries to be happy, not all the time, but we want them to develop and have good relationships with other countries. So generally, on our channel, we do see BRICS as a positive alliance, but there are issues. So yeah, and I think that this next question I want to ask you is, because what I was just asking you with BRICS and MMT, but recently we've seen, as BRICS has progressed, there's been trade between the different nations in their own currency. Now, the development of essential infrastructure capacities and essential multi-sector manufacturing are primary goals of BRICS Plus countries. In the current talks of international financial architecture reform, is that reform leading to a credit system instead of a different monetary system?
Do you mean within BRICS, the BRICS Plus countries, what the alternative financial architecture they're trying to build?
Yes, which is, there's a lot of news about that, and it's very hard to sort out. So,
Yeah.
I don't know if our audience necessarily understands the difference between a monetary and a credit system, but maybe you want to dissect that a
Yeah.
little bit. But
Right. Well, I think probably the best way to describe it is a sort of alternative financial architecture. I don't think there is an alternative sort of monetary system in the sense of a common currency per se. I don't think that is either a viable or a desirable goal of the BRICS countries to somehow adopt a common currency, right? According to, again, the MMT, as we just mentioned, that money is a sovereign power. So it's not a coincidence that we have one country, one currency system in most of the countries, right? Except for the 20 countries Eurozone, and then some of the Eastern African countries with the CFA franc zone. And as I mentioned, some of the countries gave up their own currency. But otherwise, most of the countries have their own currency, and that's for a specific reason, right? We see how the Eurozone has suffered tremendously, in the 2010s with the Euro crisis. That's because, again, when you have a monetary integration without a fiscal sort of a fiscal transfer system, right? A fiscal integration, that does not work well. And you have countries that have very different needs. And within a same monetary system, a lot of times, again, there are countries that need more fiscal support, and yet they don't get. So I think common currency is probably not the best idea for BRICS or other regional blocs for that matter. Okay, so I don't think there is a really active interest to pursue a common currency. But under this financial architecture, what you have are, I would say, more or less four different pillars. So one is, like you mentioned, a credit system, right? So to make sure that we have sufficient financing for development, for climate change, and so on and so forth. So within the BRICS group, we know there is the New Development Bank, or the BRICS Bank, right? That is going to provide, financing for the member countries. It is still relatively small in scale, but it is expanding, and it's also trying to use more local currency in their lending portfolio, right? So 30% of the lending in the next few years is supposed to be, as a goal, right? It's to be in the local currencies. So to promote more, local currency credit, right? To, again, reduce the risks of the borrowing countries. So that's the first pillar in terms of a credit system. And second is you need to have some kind of insurance system, right? So then when countries are trading with each other, they could, again, mitigate and reduce some of the risks that are involved in some of the transactions. And so that is another pillar that the BRICS are building. And then the third pillar is what I think what we are, recently has been a big topic, and that is a clearing or payment system, right? So that, again, it's in the design. There are arguments for having the similar a digital sort of a blockchain payment system that countries can use their central bank digital currency and have a distributed electronic blockchain ledger to clear between themselves. So if you are trading with me, say you're South Africa, I'm China, so you should be able to use your rand to pay for the goods that you import from me. And when I, take my yuan, I can also buy it from you. And there is a central clearing system that would help to clear between these two currencies. So some argue that the so-called mBridge, which is a pilot program led by the BIS, now BIS has abandoned the project, could be a technological blueprint for this kinds of digital clearing system. There could be also having a common clearing unit. So we're not using our currencies directly to clear between each other, but we can have a common clearing unit, and all our currencies will be in some ways anchored, right? Or in a way, I don't want to use the word packed because that could create some misunderstanding. But anyway, it's a common clearing unit that you your central bank has and my central bank has. And so when we trade with each other, right, we could use this common currency to clear between the balances between us. So that's a clearing, that's a payment system. And the last one, of course, is the contingency reserve system, right, the CRA, the contingent reserve agreements. So that, again, is sort of a what we normally economists would call a sort of a lender of last resort kind of function, that if your country is running into a balance of payment difficulty, you can tap into this contingency reserve agreement. So if you say South Africa is importing too much from China and you have a deficit with China, you're not able to pay the yuan back, well, don't worry, you can, tap into the CRA and you can borrow the yuan. So that way, you will be provided with the liquidity. So you're not going to run into a balance of payment crisis. So I think all these are, sorry,
I didn't mean to, but like a bit of a buffer, so you can go below.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. That is a buffer system, right? And so all of these, I think, are important as four pillars of that financial architecture that is different from what we are having currently, right? Where the credit system is pretty much supported by the IMF, the World Bank, and they are also supposed to be the lender of last resort, even though they have failed so many times and so badly, right, for the job.
Yes.
And so, so I think, and of course, the payment system is done through the SWIFT, right? And again, a lot of these are under the control of the global North countries, and they also weaponize, the uses of these. I would say the global public financial infrastructure, and that's why I think country groups like BRICS Plus, right, are really trying to develop a alternative system, not to necessarily replace the current structure, but really as a good sort of a supplement, an alternative, a parallel, however you want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, having an alternative, I mean, it's always good to have an alternative, right? And maybe they compete in a way. I don't think they really compete because it's not really a competition. But I really appreciate you laying out those pillars there. That's really important. So people see it's not just like one thing, like the common currency, because there's a lot of channels that are talking about this, and it's fake news, frankly, because Vladimir Putin has said we're not looking at that. The South African president said we're not looking at that, and yet it continuously comes up. But it's cool. We can talk about it, and we ask experts like you to clarify and see what you think. So that's good in a sense. And to come back to this, with the national currencies and trade, because I think this is really important, because in developing countries, in BRICS too, and they developing or not developing, they want to, which you had just explained, they really want to keep their national currencies as powerful as possible, having integrity, keeping its value, and they're subject to, again, which you just mentioned, this Western-led financial system, which doesn't have its interests. And so this is a challenge for them. So, in light of that, I want to ask you this question, which I think is very important. So international trade in national currencies can lead to one party having surplus national currency. But isn't this situation a natural and predictable consequence that would actually serve the interests of the surplus owning country to gain non-usurious interest by investing in the deficit country's capacity? Wouldn't this affect a good neighbor policy and form a closer political, commercial, and social relations?
Yeah, I think you are hinting something really important, right? I think you're right. If a surplus country is able to invest, right, in the deficit country and help the latter to improve their capability, right, to produce and to trade, then it will help to reduce the kind of the imbalances. I think that would be a good outcome, so to speak. But I think right now the difficulties are multiple, right? So there is the first is that a lot of times when a country is running a surplus, the deficit country are concerned about job losses, right? But I think any of the economists, even if they're the mainstream, they would tell you trade always creates winners and losers. And so the point here is that the winners are supposed to compensate for the losers, right? So in other words, in the trade deficit country, if the export, if the imports, right, are reducing certain sectors' jobs, then these workers need to be retrained. There should be new jobs being created in other sectors. And so these workers supposedly, again, should be able to move to new jobs and make new income and so on and so forth. But the reality is a lot of times this does not happen, right? The surplus countries are doing fine, but then deficit countries oftentimes are lacking jobs. And so that's the first difficulty. And the second difficulty is, I think, it could be in all good intention that the surplus countries is investing in the deficit countries and help the latter. But there are a lot of also, I would say, difficulties. For one is that some of these deficit countries have certain constraints that are difficult to overcome. The investments doesn't necessarily go into the sectors that are needed the most, right? So one example would be, I'm just making this up, right? So let's say country A is importing a lot of socks from country B and exporting a lot of cars to country B. And then country A decided, okay, I will use my capital and invest in country B. But what I'm going to invest is I'm going to just build more sock factories, right? I don't want to build car factories there because that would create competition, right? And it's gonna, get back at me. So I'm going to simply just put country B continuously at that low level of, value added chain. So that could be a problem where when countries see the relationships as being competitive, then you could have the scenario where the investment doesn't necessarily help the deficit countries to grow in its capability. But again, this is not necessarily to be a inherent, right, feature of the global trading system. So we could have like what you just suggested, which is that trade is not a zero-sum game. Investment or foreign investment is not a zero-sum game. And I think I would say China is doing a lot in terms of building infrastructure, transferring certain technologies, helping some of these BRICS countries and BRI participant countries to grow their own productive capacity. And I think that is I would think that this is a genuine, a good sort of format, right? A good way for the South-South cooperation is that if Africa is having all these critical minerals that China wants, then through a collective bargaining process, they should make China, right, invest in improving their value-added production to improve their capability, so that they can also industrialize instead of always being a commodity exporter.
Yeah, that question I actually formed on the basis of China being the example of doing that. Not fully, but they seem to be doing that. Genuinely interested in other countries, particularly in the BRICS nations, of helping them to develop. So, which I think is excellent, where you have a country showing a really positive example of being a good neighbor, and not for their own interest only, which is one of the principles of BRICS, is that we're going to do what's in the other person's interest, and hopefully that will be reciprocated, which is what you do in a personal relationship between people. I mean, that's usually how it's usually how we are, but in this case, it's countries. So yeah, but I want to bring up something which you just hinted on about China. So and its role in BRICS Plus and global finance, because it's very important, and you are an expert in that area. So, given your expertise in Chinese economic policy, how does the Chinese government view BRICS Plus currency initiatives? Are they more inclined towards a shared currency, a financial clearing mechanism, or another innovative solution? China particularly.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think China has the interest, right, to diversify currencies in the trading and financial system, right? This is as early as in 2008 when the global financial crisis, erupted from the United States and then basically engulfed the entire world. Back then, the central banker Zhou Xiaochuan already said, when we are so much reliant on the US dollar, we are subject to any policy mistakes, any mistakes the United States made, right? And US is definitely not a responsible player in this sort of global financial system. So it was back then, I think China already started to think about this idea of diversifying the currencies in the global trading and financial system. So in that sense, I think China is a stodgy supporter for a sort of a alternative clearing system. And you also know that China has been really actively pursuing central bank digital currency, right? And I would say China is one of the leading countries in doing so. When in the United States or others that have developed all these decentralized, private-based Bitcoin or all the different cryptocurrencies, the Chinese government is the one that is really trying to develop a centralized cryptocurrency, right? And so that is very different. So I think China does have the interest, and China is one of the 4 participant countries in the mBridge program, right? So with Hong Kong, Special Administrative Authority, and Thailand, and also UAE. So I think China is interested in developing the CBDC and also having this digital clearing system. And again, China is, one of the, I think, the major leaders in setting up the NDB and in many of these other financial architecture design. So I think, yes, China is interested in a clearing system, and it is also a big supporter for the alternative financial architecture within the BRICS.
Yeah, great. And I think they're providing excellent leadership by example, actually. And China's not perfect, and it has a very different government, I say from my own experience. And obviously, you live in West Coast USA, so you see the difference being a Chinese expert and living in a Western country. But I think they provide an excellent example of how to treat others, which I really value on the international stage and in the political stage. And in the political stage, in the respect of that, they are representatives of the people. So I think that's very important. I wanted to give this time to you, Professor Liang, to just like the last 5 minutes before we end off, on if you would like to address the audience directly on if there's something that you would like to say to the audience particularly.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I really appreciate the work that you and your colleagues do at this platform. I think what we're seeing really is, like what Gramsci was saying, right? The old world is dying, the new world is being born, and we're in a time of monsters. So I think, the geopolitical landscape is really evolving and changing very rapidly. And I think this is a great challenge for countries to navigate and manage the relationships. But it's also a great time for opportunities, right? So if the global south is able to seize the opportunity, then I think they can build up something that is really working for them, right? And so I think this is a great time. But as you just mentioned, there's also a lot of misinformation, disinformation. Some of them maybe is unintentional, but I'm pretty sure there's also a lot of intentional misleading, right, messages that are really trying to muddle the water. And I think that is very important that we are able to have a platform where we can exchange ideas and we can get some records straight. We can explore new ideas and so on and so forth. And I know that, for MMT is very interesting, right? The people who support it would really think this is a groundbreaking new way of thinking. And for people who don't really, I would say, have the interest or the time to go into what really MMT is about, would very quickly dismiss it as a, I hear people say magic money tree, right? The MMT. I am very humbled. I really, appreciate a lot of people taking the time to learn about it and be critical about it. And I think that is great for a theory to evolve. It's still a relatively new theory, right? That even though a lot of the ideas were taken from Keynes, from, many of the great thinkers before us. But this theory really, when it started, it's probably in the mid 90s. So it's a really new, right, young and still evolving theory. So I think critical thinking is much appreciated in the community. And I also think that it really holds a lot of power, right? If we really understand the nature of money and who designed the monetary system, for whose interest, and how do we take back some of these decision-making power to reshape our monetary system. And I think that is very important. And of course, any of these monetary system is not, it's not operating in a vacuum. There's the political relations, there's the geopolitical complications. So I think really what we wanted to do is, at least from my perspective, is to understand what MMT, what the implications are for development, agendas, for development policies. One of the things I think is important is, again, to embolden countries that have the kind of monetary sovereignty, right, to use the public money's power to work for their people. And second is to really understand we have a very unfair, unjust monetary system at the global level. So, the global north is able to use their power to impose debt, to impose, low value added, production, and pretty much extract all the values from the global south. So I think, MMT would have great insight to talk about how we should reform the system. Right. One of the example is, again, there is so much debt in the developing countries, and there's so much need for climate finance. COP29 has just concluded, and basically the conclusion is that developing countries now needs $1.3 trillion per year to be able to invest in, climate mitigation and climate adaptation projects, right, to counter climate change. And yet the developed countries, all they're willing to do is to provide about $250 billion a year. So as one of my colleagues said, this is not just a joke, it's an insult, right? And again, the excuse is always, this is the taxpayer money from the global north, and we don't have that much money, we can't do it, right? But the matter of fact is that the money could be created. There's enough money as long as we use them in the right place. And what is more important is to really think about how we can invest so that we can create more resources and mobilize resources and put the resources to the most important uses, right? Not to build more tanks or cannons or bullets, but rather, build more renewable energy projects and, stop drilling. And so I think all of these are very important as part of what MMT is about. It's not just a sort of intellectual or academic exercises. It's really something that I think would have wide implications in the real world.
Yeah, no, totally. And, these new concepts, Professor Liang, excuse me, sorry. I'm sorry I coughed during your briefing. It was funny though, you said magic money tree, and I know I've heard that term before when referring to MMT, and people use these sort of derogatory terms to not actually debate and talk about new ideas, which is something that we do as humans. We innovate. And I think the theory, I'm not familiar with it so much, but it has many parallels to a traditional American system, which I think has the best potential and has shown to be the best potential by example over many, many decades in America's history, as opposed to the imperial system, which we know is extremely destructive. The zero-sum game, as they put it. On your point about, and I didn't want to sort of reply to what you, but I just think it's really important because we do want to have you back, and not everything we're going to agree on, but I certainly do agree that if we with the theories of MMT, as you've sort of briefly gone over in this show, we can address things like chronic pollution, Now, climate change is something that I'm not adhering to, but I certainly think that we need to address chronic pollution, which is a major issue in countries such as Italy, where rivers are being destroyed because regulations and the government is not in charge, and corporatism is just running rampant. And that in that sense, I personally think yes, we can deal with those sort of things, but we don't have to agree on everything. But I certainly appreciate you coming and saying and teaching us and our audience. And we definitely want to have you back and explore MMT more around the BRICS issue, around particularly Africa development and the relationship with China and Africa. That's really important. But yes, thank you very much, Professor Liang. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a delight. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, that's it for the show. We hope you found this informative. Please show your support by voting up the show and sharing it with your network. We really want to get your feedback via the comment section below. So if you have something to contribute, please don't be shy. If you have questions for Professor Liang, make them and we'll forward them to her. If you subscribe to our channel, you'll have easy access to future programs and can choose to be notified by email if that's convenient for you. Below this video in the description are options to support our work financially. We appreciate any donations. Bye for now.